Dear listeners, welcome to Hidden Clue. I'm Jane, and it's such a joy to know you're spending this time with us. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you from listening tonight? And was your day a calm one or a busy one? Write a little note in the comments and be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Now, let's start. Chapter 1. The Ink-Stained Evening. The village library had never looked so festive. Garlands of ivy framed the tall windows, and the smell of pine and orange peel drifted gently through the air. Outside, snow fell in soft, unhurried flakes, but inside there was warmth, lamplight, and the comforting rustle of pages. That was before the whisper went round, the sort of whisper that travels faster than sound, that Mr. Lionel Pemberton was dead. Inspector Cray arrived within the hour, his overcoat glistening with melted snow. The hush that met him could almost have been reverence, though it was curiosity more than piety that filled the room. Villagers gathered near the fireplace, speaking in murmurs as constables lifted the stretcher through the door. Pemberton's form, covered neatly with a plaid blanket, looked terribly small for a man known to be proud of his stature. The tinkle of a dropped teaspoon echoed sharply, then all was still again. Cray's voice was steady but clipped. "No one leaves until I've spoken with each of you." He removed his gloves and looked around with the quick, appraising eyes of a man who'd seen too many surprises behind genteel curtains. Yet even he seemed momentarily unsettled by the sight of the fallen trustee. There was something indecent about death among books, too sudden, too final in a place built for quiet thought. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual unobtrusive corner, kept her knitting on her lap. She did not intrude, nor did she look away. Her sharp blue eyes moved gently across the room, taking in details others missed, the way Mrs. Dacres, the librarian, kept wringing her hands in her apron, how Tom, the young clerk, stared fixedly at the floor, and how the vicar's wife was already whispering into someone's ear. To most, grief or shock might explain it all. But to Miss Marple, there were patterns even in grief. Cray knelt beside the fallen man's chair, examining the scene. "No struggle," he muttered. "No wound, just collapsed." He glanced toward the table where a teacup sat untouched, a faint steam still curling from its surface. "Cup of tea he never drank," he said aloud, almost to himself. Miss Marple looked at that cup with quiet interest. There was something particularly lonely about an untouched drink. The man had arrived, greeted his neighbours, settled into his chair, and then, it seemed, simply ceased to move. But why? She leaned forward slightly and saw the cup's saucer bore a faint ring of dark liquid, as though someone had set it down too quickly, or perhaps had replaced it after changing cups. When the stretcher passed her chair, she noted another thing. Pemberton's spectacles were missing. A vain man, always polishing them, forever adjusting the bridge, as if to remind people of his intellect, and yet they were not on him now. She also noticed under the chair opposite a small folded slip of paper caught between the rug's fringe. Most eyes were fixed on the departing body. Miss Marple's were not. She bent, retrieving the paper as naturally as if she were rescuing a dropped stitch of wool. Inspector Cray noticed her movement. "Something there, Miss Marple?" She smiled mildly.
"Only a bit of paper, Inspector. It may be nothing at all." She offered it to him without comment. The note, smudged with ink, bore only a few words. "Meet me by the shelf at 8:30, and was unsigned. Cray frowned. 8 o'clock was when the reading began?
Who would arrange a meeting then? A rather inconvenient time for a secret, Miss Marple said softly, and returned to her knitting. The villagers began to disperse into smaller knots of conversation. Some spoke of Pemberton's work as trustee, how strict he'd been about overdue fines, how unpleasantly thorough in managing the accounts. Others lowered their voices, remembering small slights, unpaid promises, or whispered gossip about the old man's will. Each tale wound around the next, until the air itself felt heavy with speculation. Outside, the snow thickened against the windows, blurring the shapes of the world beyond. The lamplight flickered over the polished wood shelves and rows of spines, each book silently keeping its secrets. Miss Marple continued her knitting, though her thoughts were elsewhere. A cup of tea left untouched, a missing pair of spectacles, a folded note waiting beneath a chair. None of these things on their own meant very much, but together they began to sound like a story. She sighed, watching Inspector Cray carefully bag the note and order the constables to secure the scene. Around her, the village's gentle voices returned to their low, anxious rhythm, like the turning of pages in a troubled book. Somewhere in this room, she thought, someone knew the ending already, and someone else was hoping it would never be read aloud. Evening deepened, and the lamps in the library glowed with a softer, amber hue. The fire hissed gently in the grate, struggling against the chill creeping through the window panes. Inspector Cray had retired to the reading desk with his notebook, interviewing one villager after another in a low, even tone. Miss Marple, left politely to her own corner, continued to knit, though her eyes observed far more than her needles did. She had long learned that silence often coaxed truth better than questions. Mrs. Dacres, the librarian, moved nervously between the tables, her hands fluttering like anxious birds. She insisted on tidying up the returned books, though there was little to tidy. Every few minutes she would pause, glance toward the back room door, and then fuss again with a stack of novels that needed no arranging. Miss Marple noted the sheen of perspiration at her temples and the occasional tremor in her voice when she spoke. A conscientious woman, certainly, but not a calm one tonight. Poor Mr. Pemberton, Mrs. Dacres murmured, as if to no one. Such a dreadful business, dreadful. He wasn't a bad man, you know, just particular. Liked things done properly. Her eyes darted again toward the back door. I should check the records later, of course, just to be sure everything's in order. Miss Marple nodded kindly. How thoughtful of you, my dear. Order is such a comfort in times of chaos. That seemed to soothe the woman a little, though the librarian's gaze drifted once more to that shadowed door behind the lending desk. Beyond it lay the small cataloguing room, used mainly for sorting donations and old archives, hardly a place to inspire fear. And yet Miss Marple could not help but feel the tension it commanded. Across the room, Mrs. Finch was holding court with a small group of ladies. Widowhood had done nothing to quiet her tongue. "I always said," she whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear, "that Pemberton would come to a bad end."
A man so fond of his own rules is bound to make enemies. And look at poor Mrs. Dacres now, white as parchment. Mark my words, she knows more than she's saying. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. My dear Mrs. Finch, sometimes nerves come from shock, not guilt.
The widow sniffed. Perhaps, but there's shock, and then there's conscience. If you ask me, I rarely do, Miss Marple interrupted softly, her voice carrying just enough kindness to dull the sting. She returned to her knitting, leaving Mrs. Finch momentarily flustered, a victory the older lady savoured in silence. Meanwhile, Tom, the young clerk, sat near the window, his face pale beneath the warm glow of the lamp. His fingers twisted the hem of his sleeve, and his eyes followed Inspector Cray's movements with growing unease. When Miss Marple offered him a comforting word, he startled slightly as though pulled from a deep thought. "You must be tired, dear," she said gently. "It's been a long evening," he swallowed. "Yes, ma'am, it's just, I never thought I'd see anything like that."
Not here. No one ever does, she replied, watching his hands. They trembled faintly, betraying a fear not entirely born of tragedy. The storm outside grew fiercer, wind brushing the glass with feathery fingers. The snow muffled every sound.
Beyond the walls, wrapping the library in a cocoon of quiet isolation. Within, whispers replaced laughter, and every creak of the shelves seemed louder than it should. Miss Marple sensed that the entire room was holding its breath, not from grief, but from waiting, and always those furtive glances toward the back room continued. Mrs. Dacres with her anxious rearranging, Tom with his twitching hands, even Mrs. Finch now and then peering over her shoulder. It was as though something or someone waited beyond that door. The librarian, catching Miss Marple's gaze, attempted a quick smile. It didn't reach her eyes. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. She listened to the clock ticking above the mantel, steady and unyielding. In every village, in every drawing room, secrets had a way of pressing against their own doors. Tonight, she thought, the one at the back of the library was straining to open. Outside, the wind howled softly, scattering snow across the steps. Inside, the warmth and candlelight held steady, but beneath it, the air trembled with something unspoken. Everyone seemed afraid of what was hidden beyond the stacks. Chapter 2. Secrets Between the Shelves. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, with a thin crust of frost glazing the garden hedges. The village square was hushed, wrapped in that peculiar calm that follows a night of snow. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and stepped carefully along the path leading toward the library. Its windows were dark, the doors locked until Inspector Cray allowed further access. Yet the place seemed to brood beneath its blanket of white, as though even the bricks were keeping secrets, as she passed the vicarage gate. Miss Marple's mind replayed a memory from the evening before, a faint echo of raised voices drifting from behind the library shelves just before the Christmas reading began. At the time, she had thought little of it. Small tempers often flared during preparations. But now the fragments returned clearly, Mrs. Dacre's voice, sharp with distress, and Mr. Pemberton's, low but cutting. "You'll return it, or I'll see the whole matter made public," he had said.
"This isn't just negligence, it's theft." Mrs. Dacre's reply had come through trembling breath.
"You've no proof of that, Lionel."
"I did what I had to for the good of the library." The words had carried the brittle ring of fear.
Miss Marple paused at the memory, her breath misting in the cold air. Missing money, accusations, and now a death, an unpleasant little triangle of cause and consequence. Later that morning, she found herself in the vicarage kitchen, welcomed by the scent of freshly baked scones and the comforting sight of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Partridge, bustling about with teapot in hand. Few in St. Mary Mead could resist a cup of her strong assam, and Miss Marple never tried to, you heard, of course, Mrs. Partridge said, lowering her voice though they were quite alone. About Mr. Pemberton's account books? Inspector Cray was here early this morning, asking if the parish ever received its promised donation. We didn't. He seemed rather interested in that. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. How very odd. I was under the impression Mr. Pemberton prided himself on punctual generosity. Oh, indeed he did.
"But something has been amiss for weeks." Mrs. Partridge leaned forward, eyes alight with that particular blend of concern and curiosity.
"The library's accounts haven't balanced since November. Mrs. Dacres told me in confidence, well, in semi-confidence, that certain donation checks never cleared.
She said the bank made an error, but I dare say she didn't believe it herself." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her gently. "And Mr. Pemberton, I suppose, discovered the shortfall?"
"Precisely. He kept the books himself for years. You know how he was, precise to the penny. I think he confronted her about it yesterday evening, just before the readings began." "Poor woman looked quite undone."
"Poor indeed," Miss Marple murmured, gazing out the frosted window.
A robin hopped across the snowy sill, feathers puffed against the cold. Still, financial errors are rarely purely accidental, don't you think? They tend to have roots, sometimes practical, sometimes moral. Mrs. Partridge sighed, setting down her cup. "It's dreadful, really."
"I can't imagine Mrs. Dacres is dishonest."
"She's devoted her whole life to that place. Perhaps someone else meddled with the records." Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched beside her saucer. Her eyes were thoughtful, distant.
"Perhaps."
"But theft is like a shadow, my dear. It doesn't need light to exist. It moves quietly behind good intentions until it's too late to tell where it began." She rose with a polite smile.
"Thank you for the tea."
"You've been most helpful, as always." As she stepped back into the cold, the church bells chimed 11. Miss Marple looked once more toward the library, standing silent beneath the winter sky. Money missing in a place devoted to books? Was it greed or guilt at work? By afternoon, the sky had sunk into a heavy grey, and the snowstorm showed no sign of easing. The roads were declared impassable, leaving the few villagers still gathered at the library confined together under Inspector Cray's instruction. The wind pressed against the windows with a restless sigh, and the chiming of the clock above the mantel marked each passing minute like a quiet reminder of patience wearing thin. Miss Marple took it all in calmly. The tension in the air had shifted from shock to uneasy civility. Mrs. Dacre sat stiffly by the fire, her knitting untouched, her eyes dull and distant. Tom hovered near the lending desk, fidgeting with a stack of returned volumes. Mrs. Finch had settled herself by the window, watching the storm as if it might deliver her fresh gossip on the wind. While Cray questioned one villager after another, Miss Marple drifted away, her soft tread muffled by the thick carpet. The rows of books greeted her like old friends, rows of knowledge, stories, and quiet confessions bound between worn covers. Her fingers brushed across the spines with affection, pausing now and then as her thoughts turned inward. Human nature, she reflected, was rather like a well-read book. The main story was what everyone saw: good manners, daily habits, cheerful smiles. But between the lines lay the footnotes, tiny remarks, half-truths, silences, and fears that people conveniently forgot to read. Sometimes the truth was scribbled there, in the margins where no one bothered to look. She paused before the mystery section, amused at its irony, and noticed a small irregularity.
A thin space between two volumes, as though something were missing.
The dust line along the shelf confirmed it. One book had been removed recently. Curious, she leaned closer. The missing volume, according to the label, was A Christmas Carol. Fitting, she thought, for a December evening filled with ghosts of the past. Turning slightly, she glanced toward the others. Tom's eyes darted away too quickly. Mrs. Dacre's had turned paler still, her gaze flickering toward the same shelf and then away again. The vicar's wife, who had come to bring comfort, was now whispering anxiously with the inspector. Only Miss Marple seemed entirely unbothered, her composure serene as ever. Outside, the snow thickened into a white curtain, sealing the world in silence. Within, the lamplight trembled against the shadows. Miss Marple traced her fingers once more across the empty space on the shelf and smiled faintly to herself. People often believed crimes began with wickedness, but more often, she thought, they began with fear, fear of discovery, fear of loss, fear of shame. Books were no different. Each contained more truth than its author ever intended. She stepped back, her footsteps soundless against the carpet. One book was missing from the shelf, and it wasn't borrowed. Chapter 3. A borrowed book, a borrowed life. The storm had settled into a muffled rhythm against the roof, snow tapping faintly like a metronome for the tension inside. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, hands folded neatly, as Inspector Cray's questions circled closer and closer to young Tom. The boy's face was pale beneath the flickering lamplight, his collar damp with nervous sweat. When Cray finally paused, Tom drew a breath that came out as a shudder. I can't keep it quiet anymore," he stammered. "Mr. Pemberton wasn't here for the celebration tonight. He came because he meant to ruin someone." Miss Marple's blue eyes lifted sharply, though her tone remained gentle. "Ruin, my dear? That's a rather heavy word for such a pleasant evening." Tom swallowed hard. "He found something in one of the donation boxes last month."
Old books mostly. One of them had a letter in it, a real nasty one.
"He said it could ruin a person's reputation forever. He wouldn't tell me whose, only that they'd pay him well to keep quiet." A quiet sigh drifted from Miss Marple. "Blackmail, then," she murmured, as if tasting the bitterness of the word. "Such a sad business. It corrodes both the sinner and the sufferer." Cray leaned forward. "Do you know where this letter is now?" Tom shook his head helplessly. "He kept it close, sir. Said it was his insurance."
"I only know he mentioned something about an old book, A Christmas Carol, I think he said. That's how I remembered it when I saw it missing." The fire crackled. Mrs. Finch gasped softly from her seat.
The librarian, Mrs. Dacres, pressed her hand to her mouth. The colour drained from her face so quickly that Miss Marple noted it, cataloguing the reaction like an entry in her mental ledger. "How strange," Miss Marple said in her mild, thoughtful tone. "A letter hidden in a Christmas tale about redemption. Life does love its little ironies." She rose from her chair, moving slowly toward the tall bookcase once more. Her hand hovered over the empty space where the volume should have been. "Books can be rather good at keeping secrets," she said. "They're trusted, handled, passed from one soul to another. Sometimes they hold far more than words. Pressed flowers, photographs, even guilt." Tom looked stricken.
"I didn't mean to hide anything, Miss Marple. I swear I didn't."
She smiled kindly. "I'm quite sure you didn't, my dear. But someone did." Behind her, Cray cleared his throat. "So we've a missing book, a dead man, and a secret worth killing for." Miss Marple turned slightly, the light from the fire catching the silver in her hair. "And a room full of people who'd rather not be found out," she added softly. She looked once more at the empty shelf, her mind working as delicately as a weaver at her loom. Somewhere among these frightened faces lay a story pressed between the pages of a library book. Outside, the wind wailed through the eaves, carrying with it the faint echo of something that sounded, to Miss Marple at least, very much like regret. The library had grown hushed, save for the occasional creak of timber and the sigh of the wind outside. Miss Marple moved through the aisles with a shawl draped neatly about her shoulders, her small footsteps muffled on the carpet. The lamplight pooled in soft gold circles upon the floor, and dust drifted lazily through the air, like memories refusing to settle. Her fingers brushed along the bindings of books until she reached the shelf where a Christmas carol had been missing. But there, half hidden behind a row of outdated almanacs, she caught the faded green spine of the very volume in question. It had been slipped back carelessly, not quite aligned with the others. A small thing, perhaps, but small things were what Miss Marple noticed best. She lifted it gently, feeling the faint texture of age beneath her fingertips. The book opened stiffly as though reluctant to give up its secret. Between its pages lay a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with time and tied with a thin ribbon. Miss Marple loosened it carefully and began to read. The handwriting was elegant, but nervous. Letters between two villagers, written nearly 20 years earlier. They spoke of a scandal, a stolen inheritance, a forged signature, and a promise of silence bought in exchange for favour. The names, though faded, were familiar. Mrs. Dacre's late husband had been one. Another was the vicar's own brother. Miss Marple's brows knit ever so slightly, so that was it. Mr. Pemberton, always so prim in his judgments, had stumbled upon a piece of the past best left buried. He had found this letter while sorting through donations, realized its worth as a weapon, and wielded it to his advantage. But tonight, the weapon had turned on him. Miss Marple closed the book softly and held it for a moment, looking down at the embossed title, A Christmas Carol. "The ghost of past sins had come calling at Christmas," she whispered. Dickens would have approved of the irony. Behind her, footsteps approached. Mrs. Finch's voice trembled.
"Oh, Miss Marple, you're still up. It's nearly midnight." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "But Christmas Eve is a night when truths do like to rattle their chains, don't you think?"
The widow blinked, uncertain how to answer. Miss Marple offered a kind smile and returned the book to the table near the fire. "Do sit down, Mrs. Finch. Warm yourself. Tell me, do you recall any talk years ago about a will that went missing?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the back room before she shook her head too quickly.
No, not that I remember." "Ah," Miss Marple nodded as if the answer pleased her.
Curious thing, memory. It forgets only what it chooses. When Mrs. Finch hurried away, Miss Marple looked once more at the folded letters. There was tragedy here, not only of a life lost tonight, but of choices made long ago. Pemberton had been cruel, yes, but cruelty often feeds on older wounds. The storm outside deepened, muffling the village in white silence. Within the library, Miss Marple placed the documents neatly beside the teacup that had gone untouched since evening. The scene had the air of a lesson half finished. Greed, guilt, and ghosts, she murmured to herself. Every Christmas seems to bring them back. Then she settled by the fire, her eyes distant but thoughtful, as if already turning the pages of the next chapter of human folly. Chapter 4. The Librarian's Confession. The snow had quieted to a whisper by morning, its blanket softening the edges of the village. Inside the library, a dim light still burned. Mrs. Dacres sat behind her desk, hands trembling as she folded and unfolded a handkerchief. The storm had left her pale, but guilt, or perhaps exhaustion, had drained her even more. Miss Marple entered quietly, the faint scent of snow clinging to her coat. "My dear Mrs. Dacre," she began gently, "you've had a most dreadful night. I thought perhaps a bit of company might help." The librarian looked up with red-rimmed eyes.
Company?
"You mean questioning, don't you?" She gave a small, bitter laugh.
Everyone's wondering what I said to him.
Everyone heard us argue, but Miss Marple didn't deny it. She simply sat across from her, arranging her gloves neatly upon her lap.
I imagine he said something rather unkind. Mrs. Dacres pressed the handkerchief to her lips. He accused me of theft, Miss Marple.
Told me he had proof. Said he'd go to the trustees after Christmas. Her voice cracked. But it wasn't me.
I wasn't stealing from the library. It was my husband, years ago before he died. For a moment the only sound was the soft hiss of the fire.
Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you've been keeping that secret ever since?" Mrs. Dacres nodded miserably. "He was a good man, really. He only borrowed the money," he said, "just to cover some debts from the shop. He meant to put it back, but he died before he could. And when I found the ledger, I couldn't bear for the trustees to know. The library means everything to this village, Miss Marple. It's the one place people still gather without shame." "So you covered for him," Miss Marple said quietly. "A small lie for a noble cause." Mrs. Dacres laughed through her tears.
Small lies grow, don't they?
Each year I thought of confessing, but the time never seemed right. And then Pemberton found the old records in the archives. He threatened to expose everything unless I persuaded the committee to support his proposal for a new extension.
I told him I couldn't. There wasn't enough money left. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly.
"And that's when you quarrelled." "Yes." Mrs. Dacre's hands twisted the handkerchief until it tore. "He said my husband was a thief and that I was a coward. I told him he'd no right to judge. He stormed off to fetch another cup of tea."
And that was the last I saw of him alive. Tears slipped silently down her face.
Miss Marple offered a soft murmur of sympathy. "You were guilty of silence, Mrs. Dacres," she said, her tone tender yet steady. "But silence and murder are quite different creatures." The librarian looked at her helplessly.
"Then who did it?"
"Everyone thinks I had reason enough. Perhaps," Miss Marple said, gazing thoughtfully toward the window where the snow pressed against the panes. "But reason is not the same as ruthlessness. Whoever killed Mr. Pemberton acted not out of fear, but out of desperation." Mrs. Dacres swallowed hard.
"And you think I didn't?"
"I think you loved your husband too much to destroy what he left behind," Miss Marple said kindly. "And perhaps someone else loved something or someone just as fiercely." A faint knock sounded at the door. Inspector Cray stepped in, his face drawn but composed. "Mrs. Dacres," he said formally, "will need your official statement soon." She nodded weakly. Miss Marple rose, touching the woman's shoulder with a reassuring hand. "Tell him the truth, my dear. It's the one thing that doesn't vanish with the snow." As the inspector led her away, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her gaze on the half-burnt log collapsing into embers. "She was guilty of silence," she murmured, "but silence alone seldom kills." When Mrs. Dacres was led away, Miss Marple lingered behind, tidying the small desk almost absently. The librarian's spectacles lay folded beside a stack of overdue slips, their lenses still faintly misted. Beside them sat the bottle of ink that had marked so many forms and catalogues, black glass with a narrow neck and a smudge near its label. Something about it struck Miss Marple as wrong. She turned the bottle in her hand. The shape was ordinary enough, but the label wasn't one the library used. Their supplies came from the county depot, stamped neatly with St. Mary Mead Council property. This one bore a faint curling sticker, Parker's Chemist, High Street. Miss Marple remembered the place, a small shop, known equally for its stationery and its discreet medicinal trade. She replaced the bottle carefully on the desk, her eyes narrowing in thought. The inspector had gone to fetch the constable. The library was quiet again, heavy with the hush of guilt and ashes. Miss Marple moved to the window. Outside, Mrs. Dacres stood beneath the eaves, her shawl drawn tight, speaking softly to herself. The poor woman's confession had been painful, yet something about it rang true. Grief and shame are honest tones. It is deceit that trembles too smoothly. Miss Marple fetched her knitting from her bag, letting the rhythm of needles steady her thoughts. If the ink bottle had come from Parker's, it might not have been mere ink at all. Mr. Parker sold many small vials to the village, hair tonics, liniments, and, on occasion, substances best handled with caution. Rat poison, for instance, or cleaning fluid for fountain pens that contained dangerous compounds. She glanced again at the writing blotter. The stains were deep, almost oily, not the thin grey lines of ordinary ink. Miss Marple touched one with a fingertip and frowned. It carried a faint metallic sheen. "Not all bottles in a library contain ink," she murmured softly. At that moment, the door creaked open. Tom, the young clerk, appeared with a bundle of ledgers in his arms. His face was still pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the desk. "The inspector asked me to collect these," he said. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course, dear boy. Though perhaps you might tell me, did you ever notice Mrs. Dacres buying supplies herself from the chemist?" He hesitated, swallowing. "Once or twice, yes," said. The council order was delayed. "Why?" "Oh, only curiosity," Miss Marple said lightly. "Libraries are such curious places. So many stories, even in their bottles and books." When he left, she stood in the stillness once more, eyes on the dark glass bottle. The truth, she knew, often sat in plain sight, small, ordinary, and entirely out of place. And in that quiet library, beneath the weight of snow and secrets, the next chapter of the mystery had quietly turned its page. Chapter 5. The Chemist's Clue. The morning after the storm dawned pale and hushed, the village wrapped in a frosting of white so thick that even the chimneys seemed to whisper. Miss Marple, well bundled in her grey coat and knitted hat, made her way down the high street. The air smelled faintly of smoke and snow, and beneath it all that peculiar Sunday silence when every door stays closed just a little longer. The bell above Parker's Chemist gave a shy jingle as she entered. Inside the shop was a neat warren of glass jars, tonic bottles, and small brown parcels tied with string. The scent was part lavender, part linseed, with a faint trace of antiseptic. Behind the counter stood young Mr. Willett, the chemist's assistant, a tidy man with spectacles and a nervous expression. "Good morning, Mr. Willett," Miss Marple said cheerfully.
"I do hope the weather hasn't kept you from your deliveries," thinly.
"A few delays, ma'am? Mr. Parker's gone to check on the stores."
"Can I fetch you something?"
"Perhaps more of that camphor liniment you favour?" "Not today, thank you," she said mildly, her eyes roaming the shelves. "I was wondering if by any chance you've had any recent requests for almond essence, the kind used in cooking or in certain more specialized applications." The young man stiffened ever so slightly.
"Almond essence, ma'am?"
"We do sell a little at Christmas time, for baking." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but unwavering. "But I understand there was a bottle purchased a few days ago, quite small." "Bitter almond specifically?" His spectacles caught the light as he blinked. "Who told you that?" "Oh, just village chatter," she said airily, adjusting her gloves. "You know how we all gossip, especially in snowbound weather." He hesitated, his hand brushing a ledger that lay half open on the counter.
"I'm afraid I can't discuss our customer."
"Shop policy." Miss Marple nodded as though she approved of his discretion. "Quite right, Mr. Willett. Confidentiality is a fine habit, though I do wonder if that policy extends to the wastebasket." He blinked again. "The wastebasket?" She pointed delicately toward the wicker bin near his feet. A torn scrap of paper peeked from the top, its edge bearing the faint print of the shop's header. "It's amazing what bits and pieces one notices," she said pleasantly. The assistant's face coloured.
"That's nothing, just an old receipt." "Ah," she murmured.
Half a receipt, half a truth. Before he could protest, she bent slightly, an old lady's slow grace, and picked up the fragment. The paper was thin, but the ink still legible. Bitter almond essence, 26D. The customer's name, however, had been torn away. "I do hope you won't mind," she said softly, placing the fragment on the counter. "It may help clear up something rather dreadful that happened last night. Poor Mr. Pemberton, you've heard." Mr. Willett's lips parted. "Dead?"
I hadn't known. "Yes, quite sudden."
"The inspector will be along soon, I imagine. I should think he'll want to ask who might have purchased this." She gave a polite smile, thanked him for his time, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was falling again, finer now, like sifted sugar. In her pocket, the torn receipt rustled softly, an unfinished story waiting for its other half. The village cafe was a haven against the chill. Its windows steamed from the warmth of the morning fire. Miss Marple settled at her usual corner table, her hat and gloves resting neatly beside her teacup. Around her, the murmur of conversation rose and fell like gentle waves, spoon against saucer, chair against floor, all the small rhythms of ordinary life continuing after tragedy. Yet under the chatter there was tension, the kind that hums through a room when everyone pretends not to know what everyone else is thinking. Tom sat 2 tables away, his shoulders hunched as he stirred sugar into his tea. The spoon clinked against the cup in an uneven rhythm. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled slightly, a night of little sleep or a conscience uneasy. He glanced often toward the window, as if measuring the distance to the door. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Ellison, joined Miss Marple at her table, removing her gloves with brisk efficiency. "Dreadful business, poor Mr. Pemberton," she sighed. "And so near Christmas, too. You were there, weren't you? How terrible for you all." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "One grows rather accustomed to such unpleasantness, though one never ceases to feel it." "Sugar," Mrs. Ellison declined with a flutter of her hand. "The inspector was at the rectory this morning, asking about the library funds. My husband said he'd seen nothing irregular. Though," she added, lowering her voice, "I did see young Tom by the chemist's on Tuesday afternoon. He looked quite pale, as if he'd been caught doing something he oughtn't." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward Tom again.
"Oh, perhaps he was fetching medicine for Mrs. Dacres."
The vicar's wife shook her head. "No parcel that I saw. Just his hands in his pockets and that guilty look boys wear when they've broken a window."
"I meant to ask if he was all right, but he hurried off." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully.
"Perhaps the inspector will find it useful to know." Her tone was mild, yet her gaze was intent, observing the small details, the trembling hand, the nervous swallow, the way Tom's eyes avoided everyone else's. The boy rose at last, paid for his tea, and made for the door. As he stepped outside, he nearly collided with Mrs. Finch, who gave him a suspicious look. The encounter left him flustered, almost frightened. Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly. "Even innocence trembles," she murmured, "when secrets weigh heavy." Mrs. Ellison frowned.
"Do you think he knows something, Jane?"
"Oh, I think we all do in our way," Miss Marple replied, her tone serene. "Some know too much, and some simply can't bear to hold it any more." Outside, Tom crossed the street toward the library, his figure small against the white glare of snow. Miss Marple watched him go, the torn receipt in her handbag, the puzzle in her mind beginning, at last, to take its shape. Chapter 6. The Widow and the Will. The afternoon light slanted through the library's frosted windows, painting pale gold bars across the worn carpet. Mrs. Finch, the widow with the soft voice and sharper eyes, stood by the hearth twisting her wedding ring nervously.
"I don't like to speak ill of the dead," she began, but Mr. Pemberton was meddlesome, Miss Marple.
"Always prying into other people's papers. Always writing letters no one asked for." Miss Marple nodded gently, her knitting needles resting in her lap. "Yes, dear, and sometimes those who meddle find themselves caught in their own threads. But you said you had something important to tell the inspector. Mrs. Finch looked around, lowering her voice.
He's not here, is he?
Good, I'd rather tell you first. You see, the night before last, Mr. Pemberton came to me with a document to witness.
A will. A will?
Miss Marple repeated softly. And whose, might I ask? His own, said Mrs. Finch. He said he'd had a change of heart. Wanted to make amends.
I thought it odd, so near Christmas, but he was insistent.
I signed as witness along with young Tom, though the boy looked fit to faint doing it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly.
And this will, did he say who was to benefit?
Mrs. Finch hesitated, then whispered, He left a good portion to someone marked only by initials. D.D., I thought it might be one of his London relations. But now, after what's happened, well...
I can't help thinking of Mrs. Dacres. Her maiden name was Deborah Dunsby, wasn't it?
The room seemed to draw tighter around them, the air suddenly heavy. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew keen. Yes, it was indeed. And you're quite right to find that peculiar. Mrs. Finch nodded eagerly. He said it was a matter of conscience that he wished to set things right. He even hinted that the will would clear up some long-standing injustice. I thought it best not to ask. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, slow and thoughtful. A new will, a promise of restitution, initials that match a woman burdened by old secrets. She sighed quietly. The initials in the will told a story no one wished to read. Mrs. Finch shivered. Do you think she knew? I rather think she didn't, Miss Marple replied. But others might have guessed, and in guessing, feared what that knowledge could bring.
A new will can change more than inheritance, Mrs. Finch. It can reorder loyalty, disturb guilt, even tempt someone to hasten what fate intended to wait. Outside, the church bell struck 4.
The sound drifted faintly through the snow. Mrs. Finch pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Oh, Miss Marple, it's wicked, isn't it? Money and memory both can turn people cruel. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. But sometimes they merely reveal what was already there. She looked toward the desk where Pemberton's papers still lay in neat piles, and for the first time she felt the threads of greed, regret, and duty begin to entwine into a single telling pattern. Inspector Cray stood by the library table, his brow furrowed, the new will spread open before him. Well, this settles it, doesn't it? He declared. Motives clear as daylight. Mrs. Dacres stood to gain a small fortune, and perhaps to erase her shame. That's reason enough for murder. Miss Marple, sitting primly by the window, looked up from her knitting. Oh, my dear Inspector, motives are seldom so tidy. A will might give reason, yes, but not necessarily opportunity, nor temperament. Cray gave a short laugh. You've too much faith in people, Miss Marple. Guilt and money make faster companions than you think. Indeed they do, she said mildly. Yet I can't help feeling something doesn't fit. Mr. Pemberton only signed this will the evening before he died. If Mrs. Dacres knew nothing of it, how could she act so swiftly? Poison requires preparation, the inspector frowned. Then who else would have reason? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes had drifted to the ledger table where the ink bottle still rested.
Sometime, she said softly, the answer lies not in what's written, but in who did the writing. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and crossed to the table.
Do you see this blotter, Inspector? Fresh ink, still faintly glossy. And yet, according to young Tom, no one wrote anything after the catalogues were done yesterday afternoon.
Curious, isn't it?
Cray followed her gaze. The boy might have been mistaken. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused. Though I noticed something rather telling, an ink smudge on his cuff when he poured tea last night. Not the faint blue of library ink, but darker with a sheen. Much like the bottle that came from the chemist. The inspector's expression tightened.
You think the boy's involved?
I think, said Miss Marple, that fear sometimes drives even the innocent to foolish acts. But this fear feels different. The will was witnessed by him, yes, but did he realize what it meant? That Mrs. Dacres would inherit, not he? Young men have been known to hope for kindness from their superiors, and disappointment can wound sharply. Cray folded his arms. That's speculation. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed cheerfully. But speculation is the seed of discovery, is it not? Let us suppose, just for thought, that Tom knew of the will. Suppose also that Mr. Pemberton taunted him with it, Perhaps threatened to dismiss him after Christmas. That would explain the trembling hands, the pale face. The inspector paced. Then why the poison? Miss Marple's gaze returned to the ink bottle. Perhaps he didn't mean to kill at all. A drop in the cup just to make the man ill, to delay his boasting. But death, Inspector, often arrives uninvited. Cray stared at her.
You think this was an accident?
I think, she said, her voice low and measured, that the pattern of guilt is rarely straight. Sometimes it runs like ink across blotting paper, uneven, spreading further than one meant. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and slow, blanketing the village in white secrecy. Within the library, Miss Marple's calm eyes lingered on the cuff of a coat hanging by the door, a faint ink stain catching the light. Sometimes, she whispered, guilt writes its own confession, in ink. Inspector Cray stood beside the heavy oak desk, the new will laid out before him like a verdict. Well, he said with a note of satisfaction, it's clear enough now. Mrs. Dacre's had every reason. This will make her richer than she's ever been.
I'd call that motive, wouldn't you?
Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting balanced neatly in her lap. The needles clicked softly, a sound both soothing and deliberate. Motives, she said mildly, are curious things, Inspector. They can be found in the most unlikely of people, and often they lead us astray. Cray frowned. You can't mean to suggest Mrs. Dacre's is innocent. Innocence, Miss Marple said, is a word that tends to tremble when secrets weigh heavy.
I'm not defending her, merely saying the timing feels wrong. He looked puzzled.
Wrong how? Miss Marple glanced toward the frost-rimmed window. This will was signed the very evening before Mr. Pemberton died. Mrs. Dacre's could not have known of it. If she didn't know, how could she act upon it so swiftly? Poison, after all, requires more than opportunity. It requires planning. Cray grunted. Perhaps she overheard him. Or perhaps someone told her. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed softly. But I prefer facts to perhapses. And one such fact has been troubling me since last night. She reached for her teacup, her tone light, but her eyes keen. When young Tom poured the tea, I happened to notice a small smudge on his cuff, ink, quite fresh. I remember it because he'd just finished saying he hadn't been doing any writing that evening.
Odd, don't you think?
Cray blinked.
Ink on a clerk's cuff?
That's hardly evidence of murder. No, indeed, she replied serenely. But it is evidence of falsehood, and falsehood, in my experience, tends to guard something inconvenient. The inspector paced, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. So you're saying the boy forged something? Possibly.
Or altered something. I can't yet tell which.
But when a person lies about something as trivial as ink, there's usually a reason deeper than vanity. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Suppose, Inspector, that Tom saw the new will or even helped write it. Suppose he realized that the bequest to D.D. would leave him with nothing. He might have thought Mr. Pemberton unjust or cruel. Disappointment can make a sensitive soul reckless. Cray shook his head. You think a frightened boy poisoned his employer? That's a long reach, Miss Marple. Her knitting resumed its rhythm, calm as ever.
Oh, I don't think he meant to kill.
Poison can be a mistake, a drop too much,
a delay too long.
Intent and outcome often part ways in tragic company. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, the clock ticked, and somewhere outside a church bell chimed the quarter hour. Then Miss Marple added, almost to herself, sometimes guilt writes its own confession, in ink. Cray turned sharply.
You think the ink was the start of it? I think, she said, setting down her knitting. It's a trail.
One that began on his cuff and may end with what's missing from that desk. She rose, moving toward the papers scattered across the table. This will was written in haste, and yet its witness signatures are perfectly dry.
Someone recopied it, Inspector.
Perhaps even twice. Cray stared at her, the realization dawning. You mean the will we have might not be the one Pemberton signed? Miss Marple gave a faint, knowing smile. It may very well be the one someone wanted us to find. Chapter 7, Midnight at the Library. By evening the storm had turned the village into a dream of white silence. Snowflakes drifted through lamplight like falling dust from an unseen attic, and the only sound was the creak of boots over frozen paths. The library loomed softly in the dark, a glow of amber through frosted windows, promising warmth yet heavy with memory. Miss Marple and Inspector Cray stood at the entrance as the others arrived, one by one. Mrs. Dacres wrapped her shawl tighter, her eyes downcast. Mrs. Finch bustled in next, talking too much, her chatter a thin shield against unease. Tom followed last, pale as parchment. His steps faltered when he saw the inspector's stern expression, but Miss Marple greeted him with her gentle smile, as if this were no more than a late-night errand. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the bookshelves. Miss Marple took a seat at the librarian's desk. "I thought," she said mildly, "that since we are all gathered here again, it might be useful to review Mr. Pemberton's belongings before they are removed. So easy for something to be lost in confusion." Cray gave a grunt that could be taken for agreement. The others nodded uncertainly.
None wanted to be there, yet none dared to leave.
Outside, the wind sighed against the windows, muffling the village's heartbeat. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the familiar space, the reading tables, the glass cabinet, the chair where Mr. Pemberton had slumped only a night ago. "It's strange," she murmured, "how a room remembers. Every sound and gesture lingers somewhere, waiting to be noticed." No one spoke. Even Mrs. Finch's tongue had fallen still. The lamps flickered, and the air smelled faintly of damp wool and polished wood. Cray broke the silence at last. "What exactly are you hoping to find, Miss Marple?" "Oh," she said, folding her hands, "nothing dramatic, merely a sense of how things were."
People reveal themselves in repetition, you know.
"One might say the truth prefers familiar settings." She turned toward Tom, whose eyes darted toward the back room. "Would you be so kind as to light the lamp near the circulation desk? We must see things as they were." Tom hesitated, then obeyed. The match flared, catching the gleam of brass and glass. The flame trembled before settling into steady glow. Miss Marple looked around the circle of uneasy faces and said softly, "There now. The shelves stand like silent witnesses. Let us for a moment listen to what they might remember." And with that, the little gathering fell into hush, the kind of stillness where even truth seems to hold its breath. The library clock struck 9, each chime falling like a slow heartbeat. The little group stood where they had on the night of Pemberton's death. Miss Marple sat in the same armchair by the fire, her knitting beside her. Inspector Cray stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, watching closely. Tom set the tea tray on the table, 3 cups, a small pot, a sugar bowl. His hands trembled as he poured. "It feels strange," he muttered. "Doing this again?" "Strange, yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But truth often hides in the ordinary. Let us see how ordinary this feels." The cups clinked softly, steam curling into the lamplight. The others watched, barely breathing. Then, just as before, Tom's hand shook and the cup tipped, spilling tea across the table. The dark liquid ran toward the edge, dripping onto the floor. Inspector Cray frowned. "Careful, lad." But Miss Marple's eyes never left him. "No harm done?" she said.
Accidents do repeat themselves when the nerves are guilty. Tom froze, a flicker of panic in his gaze. I didn't mean—" "Of course you didn't," she said kindly. "Just as you didn't mean to kill Mr. Pemberton. I dare say it was all a dreadful mistake," Mrs. Finch gasped, pressing a gloved hand to her mouth. Mrs. Dacres turned pale as paper.
Cray stepped forward, voice sharp.
"Miss Marple, what are you saying?"
"I am saying," she replied calmly, "that the ink bottle on Mr. Pemberton's desk never held ink. It held cyanide, bitter almond essence to be precise. The same scent one notices faintly on the rim of that teacup." She turned to Tom. "You see, I noticed your cuff again tonight. The same smudge, though there's no ink pot here. You've been using that bottle for something else entirely, haven't you?" Tom's mouth opened, then closed again. His hands twitched, as if he wished to hide them. He was blackmailing Mrs. Dacres," he stammered.
"I only wanted to frighten him, just to make him stop."
Miss Marple's tone softened.
"I thought as much."
"But poison is never a harmless fright. A drop misjudged, a sip too deep, and one becomes both victim and culprit in the same breath." Cray took a step closer. You admit it then? You put the poison in his cup. Tom's voice cracked. He laughed at me. Said I was a fool, that I'd never be more than a clerk. I only wanted him to feel a little of the fear he gave others. The confession fell into the room like ash.
No one moved.
Outside, the wind whistled against the panes, scattering snow like torn paper. Miss Marple rose, her face tender but grave.
Poor boy. Evil seldom begins with malice. It begins with hurt pride and ends in tragedy. You must go with the inspector now.
The law must take its turn, though I believe your heart never meant full cruelty. Cray nodded solemnly, leading Tom toward the door. Mrs. Dacres wept quietly into her handkerchief. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple stood alone among the rows of books. She touched one spine, A Christmas Carol, and murmured, "Yes, even ghosts find peace in time." The lamps flickered once more, and the shelves, tall and patient, seemed to sigh. The ink, the tea, the silence, all had told their story at last. The ink had been only a disguise for death. The library was still but for the whisper of snow at the windows. Lamps burned low, their glow pooling softly over the long tables. Miss Marple sat with her hands folded, watching, as the scene from the previous night quietly unfolded again. Tom moved stiffly, his face drained of colour. Mrs. Finch hovered near the hearth, and Mrs. Dacres stood by the circulation desk, twisting her gloves with restless fingers. Inspector Cray gave a curt nod. "Proceed," he said.
Just as it happened, Tom reached for the teapot.
His hand trembled slightly as he poured, the sound of liquid against porcelain breaking the hush. Miss Marple's gaze never left him. She noted the way his cuff brushed the handle of the pot, how his eyes flicked nervously toward the table's edge. "Careful, Mr. Tom," she murmured.
A second spill might seem unfortunate. Her words caught him mid-motion.
For a moment he looked bewildered. Then the inevitable happened. The cup tipped again, dark tea cascading across the table in a pattern eerily familiar. Mrs. Finch gasped, and the smell of bergamot drifted faintly through the air. Tom fumbled for his handkerchief, wiping his cuff with desperate haste. Miss Marple's eyes softened.
"There now," she said gently.
"Some stains are rather difficult to wash away, don't you find?" He froze. The others looked on, puzzled. Miss Marple turned slightly in her chair, her voice quiet but clear. Mr. Pemberton's ink bottle was an odd thing, not the kind the library keeps in stock, and yet it sat so prominently upon his desk.
"A curious shade, too, almost too pale for ink." Inspector Cray frowned.
"Meaning what, Miss Marple?" She met his gaze. "Meaning, Inspector, that it was never ink at all. The contents smelled faintly of almonds, bitter ones. That, you see, is the scent of cyanide." Mrs. Finch uttered a thin cry, while Mrs. Dacres clutched the back of a chair for balance. The air seemed to shrink around them. Miss Marple went on, her tone calm and almost tender. "Poison disguised as something ordinary. How easy it is to overlook. But I noticed Tom's cuff last night, smudged as though from writing, though he swore he hadn't touched a pen.
I wondered why.
Tonight I see the same smudge again, though there's no ink in sight." Tom's mouth opened, but no sound came. His face was chalk white, eyes darting toward the desk where the small bottle still rested. "You didn't mean to kill him, I imagine," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps you wished only to frighten him, to teach him a lesson. But guilt has a way of writing its own confession, sometimes in ink, sometimes in something far darker." Inspector Cray stepped forward, his boots echoing faintly on the wooden floor. "Tom," he said, his voice low and firm, "is there truth in what she says?" Tom looked at them all, the kindly old lady, the stern inspector, the two women watching in horror, and his composure crumbled.
He laughed at me," he whispered. "He found that letter and said he'd ruin Mrs. Dacres unless I helped him. I just wanted to scare him."
"Just one drop, only one."
"I thought it would make him ill, not—"
His voice broke. The library fell silent again, the only sound the wind outside brushing snow against the glass. Miss Marple rose, her expression filled with sorrow.
Human folly, Inspector? She said softly.
So often it begins with pride and ends with regret. The ink was only a disguise for death. Chapter 8, The Confession and the Carol. The storm had gentled by morning. Snow lay thick over the square, muffling every sound as if the world itself wished for silence. Inside the library's small meeting room, the air was still. The fire, newly lit, flickered behind its grate, and Inspector Cray sat across from Tom, whose pale face seemed even whiter beneath the dim lamplight. Miss Marple occupied the corner chair, knitting needles resting idly in her lap. Her expression held that rare blend of patience and pity. She had seen enough of life to know that wickedness and weakness often wore the same face until the moment of confession. Tom's voice trembled.
I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he began. Mr. Pemberton found an old letter, something that belonged to my father. Years ago, when he worked at the parish accounts, he
took money. It was small, and he paid it back before he died, but Mr. Pemberton said he could make it public again. Said it would ruin me if anyone knew. Cray nodded grimly, making notes. And so you sought revenge? Tom shook his head violently.
No, I wanted him to stop.
I went to the chemist. I thought, if I had something to frighten him with, he'd leave me be. I bought the almond essence. I knew cyanide could be deadly, but I only mixed a few drops with water in an old ink bottle.
I thought he'd notice the smell, see that I wasn't helpless.
I never meant for him to drink it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but steady. Yet he did. Tom nodded, eyes glistening. He came to the library early that evening, said he wanted to finish the paperwork for the donation fund. He took my desk by the window. I'd left the bottle there, planning to empty it later. He poured himself a cup of tea, then reached for my pen and the bottle beside it. I told him not to touch it, but he only laughed. Said I looked like a child caught with jam on my fingers.
And then
his words faltered. For a long moment the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of the fire. He dipped the pen. Tom continued in a whisper. And then he tasted the tea. It was too fast.
I didn't even think it could happen that quickly. One minute he was scolding me, the next he fell forward. I panicked. I thought everyone would think I'd done it on purpose. Cray exhaled slowly.
You tampered with evidence? Tom nodded miserably. I hid the note he'd been writing, moved the ink bottle, wiped what I could. But Miss Marple, she saw everything I'd missed. The old lady inclined her head slightly. It isn't cleverness, my dear.
Only observation, and a lifetime spent noticing what people try to hide. Tom's hands twisted together on the table.
I wasn't trying to be evil.
I was afraid. I just wanted to protect my father's name. Miss Marple gave a small sigh, her eyes warm with sadness.
Guilt, like ink, has a way of spilling. One blot leads to another until the page can no longer be read. You wished only to keep a secret, but secrets, once touched by fear, rarely stay gentle. Outside, a carol began faintly in the street, children's voices rising against the cold. Tom lifted his head slightly, eyes wet. It's Christmas Eve, he said softly. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. And even the darkest hearts deserve light to see what they've done. Inspector Cray rose slowly from his chair, closing his notebook with a muted snap. The sound seemed to end something final in the little room. Tom sat motionless, staring at the floor. Outside, faint strains of Silent Night drifted through the frosted window panes. Children's voices, thin and pure, against the hush of falling snow. Miss Marple stood, smoothing the folds of her cardigan.
Inspector, she said softly, perhaps it would be kind to let the boy walk out quietly. Shame is punishment enough tonight. Cray's stern expression wavered, and after a pause he nodded.
Very well, Miss Marple. The station can wait until morning. He turned to Tom. Come along, lad. Tom looked up, his eyes red but dry. Would they think me a monster? Miss Marple shook her head gently.
Monsters are made by cruelty.
You made a mistake, an unforgivable one perhaps, but it was born of weakness, not wickedness. There's a difference, though it seldom comforts. He stood unsteadily, and for a moment the firelight caught the faint shimmer of tears on his cheeks. Cray placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, and together they stepped toward the door. The wind stirred as it opened, carrying in a swirl of cold air and a snatch of song. Sleep in heavenly peace. When they had gone, the room fell still again. Miss Marple turned back toward the hearth. The flames burned low, curling around the last of the logs. On the mantel lay a single forgotten teacup, its rim faintly stained, its surface calm now, as if the chaos of the past night had been only a bad dream. She picked it up delicately and set it beside the others on the tray. "So much trouble," she murmured, "over such small everyday things." Tea ink pride. How much sorrow they can hide within their ordinariness. From the main hall came the faint echo of the clock striking 10. The sound rolled through the empty aisles and along the rows of books, each one gleaming faintly beneath the dim lights. Miss Marple walked among them, her fingertips brushing along the spines. Dickens, Eliot, Austen, they stood patiently, their worlds untouched by death or deceit. "The library," she said softly to herself, "holds stories again, not secrets. Outside, the storm had spent itself. Snow lay smooth across the square, untouched except for the faint trail left by Cray and Tom's boots. The lamp-posts gleamed faintly through the mist, and a few villagers, hearing the music, stepped out to listen. Miss Marple paused at the door, adjusting her scarf. The night air was crisp and sweet, the kind of air that smelled of pine and peace. The carolers had gathered near the churchyard now, their candles flickering like distant stars. As she closed the library door, she looked back once more at the quiet room. The tables were cleared, the lamps turned low, and the faint scent of old paper filled the air. Whatever grief had touched this place would fade, she knew, folded away like a forgotten chapter. She drew her coat tighter and started down the lane. The village lay under its white blanket, rooftops glimmering, windows glowing softly. Somewhere a clock chimed the hour, and the sound seemed to mingle with the carol's final verse, gentle, forgiving, eternal. Miss Marple smiled faintly.
"Peace on earth," she whispered.
"Even here." And as she walked home through the stillness, her footprints slowly filled with snow, the world of St. Mary Mead returned, at last, to its ordinary comfort, the library holding stories once more, and the night closing softly around its secrets.